All right, guys, we are going to go through some toy game exercises. And before we get into it, I want to explain why we're going to go through some toy game exercises. So the reason for doing this type of work is without this type of work, it's very difficult to study river play. Okay. So the tools for studying rivers are somewhat primitive when it comes to actual real game hands. So tools like PO Solver, etc., modeling out all of the flops is quite easy using spreadsheets. But then modeling out all the turns for all those flops is like a non-linear exercise where like it explodes in terms of the total number of spreadsheets, and it would continue to do that for rivers. So trying to analyze river play by analyzing all of the rivers the way that we do it for all of the flops is not really feasible. Okay, so spreadsheet work doesn't work for studying rivers, in my opinion, at the moment. Okay, maybe someone will figure out how to do it, but at the moment, I wouldn't know how to do that. Okay, so that takes out one of the primary means of studying rivers. It's basically like it's an overwhelming amount of data is the problem. Okay, so we can't go that direction. We can't go and see every single one, which is what we actually do in flops when we study flops in a sophisticated way. That's a big part of it. Okay, so that's out. We can't use charts the way you do for preflop. Okay, so preflop gets simplified with charts, and we just kind of copy what the charts do. So that's for studying rivers. Again, that doesn't work. So we have to have some way of taking all of this overwhelming data, all this overwhelming number of different types of river situations where you have a unique flop and then a unique turn and then a unique river, right? Or a unique pre-flop situation, a unique flop and a unique turn and a unique river. And there are so many of those. How do you possibly come up with good strategy for all of them? Okay. And again, the traditional tools in the context that they're normally used will fail you. It just won't work. That's where toy games come in. Okay. So this is now why we're doing this exercise. Okay. So toy games, what we can do is we can study what I would call archetypes. Okay. You can study these archetypes. So different types of situations, different types of compositions that represent a large number of in-game scenarios. Okay. So essentially models. And you can see how those models behave. And then you can model your behavior after those models when you're in those situations with hands that have similar equity profiles to the hands in the model. Okay. So this might sound like a lot of mumbo jumbo. Totally get it. It's going to become pretty clear as we go. But understand that this is essentially a method of dealing with a problem when it comes to studying rivers. And the problem when it comes to studying rivers is the problem of overwhelming data. It's like a complexity problem. There is simply too much. There are too many unique scenarios to even plot them onto a spreadsheet. So let alone digest it. Okay. So so what we do is we go the opposite direction. Instead of doing anything even close to that, we go as simple as we possibly can. We study a few archetypes for river toy games. And from that, we have behaviors that we can see emerge. And then when we have hands that fit those hand classes or equity profiles, we just behave in a similar way. Okay. So that's the idea. That's what we're trying to accomplish by doing this. This is the way that I teach rivers in BBC Poker to all of my students in the seminars, like one-on-one, whatever. When I'm working with Lex, it's all like, if you want to understand rivers, you got to go with toy games, in my opinion. Okay. So what do we have here? So we have two. So it says it up here. We have two symmetric ranges with a 1x SPR. Okay. Two symmetric ranges with a 1x SPR. And we've got black, which means we've got clubs and spades, and then on the other hand, we've got red. Okay. Now by organizing it with black and red, what we basically have is there's no overlap in the combos. Okay. If you have ace of clubs, ace of spades, you'd have no interactions with ace of hearts, ace of diamonds. Okay. So these are two ranges. They're both symmetric. They're both identical, but there's no blocking effects to take into account. In this way, we can see kind of behavior emerge. It's very clean. You don't have to worry about, we have less to worry about. We can focus on the basics. Okay. So these are two identical ranges with no overlapping qualities whatsoever. The board is deuce, 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 3-3. The ranges are aces through fours. So the board also does not interact with the hand ranges, okay, because neither range has deuces or threes, and those are the cards on the board, okay. And then the starting pot is 100 chips. The effective stacks are 100 chips. So we've got a 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio. And all bet sizings are enabled for both players, okay. So obviously, when you're dealing with a 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio, you can't overbet, but we're going to look at multiple stack to pot ratios, and these bet sizes will become relevant later. Okay, so basically all bet sizes are enabled for both players, and all raise sizes are enabled for both players. And now we can just kind of get into how should we behave? If you have, so you can think about it. What would you do if you've got a stack to pot ratio of 1-to-1? You've got the same range as your opponent, aces through fours, and you're the out of position player. What would you do? How do you think about the behavior for out of position being different from in position? You can pause this video and go ahead and think, what would I do as the out of position player? If I have all of these bet sizes enabled, how would I behave? What bet sizes would I choose? Why would I choose those? What are my reasons for choosing those? What hands would I bet if the hands that I can have are aces through fours and my opponent can also have aces through fours? What hands would I bet? What hands would I check? What sizing choices would I use? Why would I choose those sizing choices? You can take it a step further if you want. If you've thought about that, pause the video and thought about it, you can then think about the same thing from in position. What would in position do if check to? What bet sizes would the in position player choose? What bet sizes would the in position player not choose? Okay. And these types of exercises, I know they can be tedious because I've consumed lots of content myself from other people. These exercises can be tedious when you're asked to do them, but the rewards of doing them are that especially if you write them down, if you type it out or something like that, if you've got a record of your answer, you can see like I was wrong. And that's very valuable because when you have something telling you, hey, you're wrong, that's a very powerful way to change your behavior. Whereas if you just like see the outputs, you're like, oh, like I kind of know, like, oh yeah, like that, I expected that. And you get this like really wishy-washy response to the content and you don't learn as much. So I really would encourage you to pause it and try to go through the steps of what you think the behavior is going to look like going forward. Okay, so now that you've done that exercise, we've got, you tried to predict what the strategy would look like. I'm sure all of you nailed it and you got this exact behavior, perfect. Okay, so let's get into it. So what can we observe? What's happening and how can we use this, the ideas that we observe here, how can we use this behavior to impact our in-game playing immediately, like right away? What ideas do we see that we observe immediately that are obvious to us that can change the way that we play rivers as the out of position player? Keep in mind, there is a sharp distinction between out of position and in position. We are currently evaluating out of position. Okay. I can't state that. I can't make that more I can't stress that enough or emphasize it enough. Don't get confused and think that out of position strategy will apply to in position. It won't. Okay. Out of position and in position strategy are radically different, and we are currently analyzing out of position. Okay. Again, I'm trying to make that very clear because I don't want people who watch this and observe it to like mistransfer information, because that's also very common. You learn something and you misapply it. That's like almost given. And a little bit of misapplication can be okay, but systematic misapplication is where you get into real trouble. Systematic misapplication is where you think you're doing something right, and you're doing it over and over and over and over and over again, and you're like completely wrong. Okay, so like if you're a little rough around the edges, that's okay. But I don't want you to take this out of position strategy and then copy and paste it onto your in position strategy and fail, basically. So just again, I can't stress it enough. I know it's a long primer for the fact that we're looking at out of position, but it's real important that you keep this straight. We are looking at out of position. All right. So what do we see immediately? The first thing that stands out to me are the pure bet combos: fours, tens, jacks. So let's start with fours. Fours is a bluff. So what we see is it's not bluffing with 5s or 6s or 7s or 8s or 9s. It's bluffing from the bottom of its range. What does that actually mean, bluffing from the bottom of the range? It's bluffing with the combo that's worth the least. It's bluffing with the lowest EV combo. If you check pocket 4s, it's going to win no fraction of the pot. Because if you check pocket 4s, your opponent's going to bluff with his pocket 4s. Okay. And you're not even going to get the chopping equity of pocket 4s. It's worthless to you. Pocket 4s is worthless to you. Okay. So this hand has 0 EV in the check option. You can actually go ahead and take a look at it. If you check pocket 4s, is strategy and EV. So the EV are these little numbers down there. You can see that the EV of checking pocket 4s is 0, and the EV of checking pocket 5s is 0.82. So pocket 5s can capture some EV if it checks. Your opponent will check a little bit of pocket 5s, presumably, and you'll win a little bit. You can see that pocket 6s get 6. Again, these are as fractions of the pot. Okay. So pocket 4s is 0. Pocket 5s is less than 1. Pocket aces is 136. Okay, so just so you can understand the spectrum, some people may, why is pocket aces worth more than the pot? Because when it gets called, it wins. So it wins more than the pot. Okay, so we have that very important starting point. So you're bluffing automatically. Out of position is bluffing from the bottom of its range or with the lowest EV combos it has. Now keep in mind there are no blocking effects to think about. There are none. In game there will be blocking effects to think about. But in a poker 101 context where you don't know your opponent's range very well, okay? So if you can't handicap your opponent's range, you can't block it very well, okay? So in situations where you're playing in game, out of position, and you either have an inability to handicap your opponent's range because you don't have the skill set to do that, or you're just confused, you should start evaluating the bottom of your range. You should try to identify the bottom of your own range, the lowest EV combos you have, and bluff with those. That's what's happening here. You can also see that the bluff is being allocated across, the pocket 4s is being allocated to a range of bet sizes. Okay, pocket 4s is betting to pot, which is a commonly chosen bet sizing up here. Pocket 4s is betting to half pot, to 30%, and to a 10% sizing. So pocket 4s is bluffing all the time, more or less. But to which sizing choice, it gets allocated to all of these buckets, all of these respective buckets. Okay, it doesn't just get allocated to one of them. Okay, that's another characteristic of pocket 4s. Okay, cool. So that's the bluff. We got that out of the way. I guess the other pure combos, which I kind of skipped, are pocket 5s through pocket 9s. So these hands clearly have some EV in the check option. We saw that with pocket 5s. Okay, so these hands are better than pocket 4s, and we kind of simply can classify these hands as bluff catching hands. These hands beat bluffs, but presumably won't beat value bets, and they're all being checked. So these hands are weak hands, capable of beating pocket 4s, which is presumably going to be the opponent's bluff. We don't know that yet, but based on the fact that we're bluffing with pocket 4s, it's probably reasonable that our opponent does the same thing. So 5s through 9s, these hands are hands that potentially beat bluffs, don't get much value. If you bet pocket 5s, you're not going to get called by worse hands, for example. So these hands are purely checked. This type of hand where you have hands that are stronger than your bluffs, but only barely. Hands that are just barely stronger than the hands you want to bluff with should be checked. So that's a pure behavior. These hands are all behaving in this way all the time. Very important to note. Okay. Then 10s and jacks, the next hands that are pure bets. So this is something that I think is very common for people to screw up. Why are 10s and jacks betting, but queens, kings, and aces aren't pure betting? Right? Aces, kings, and queens are being allocated to all these different bet sizing choices. Jacks and 10s are and check, right? And checking. Whereas jacks and 10s, in particular jacks is really just, primarily just betting 30%, occasionally betting half pot, and checking never, shoving never, betting 10%, never. So why are jacks and 10s, which are not the nuts, why are they being purely bet? And this is in truth, this is one of the most common mistakes I diagnose when I'm coaching people and trying to help improve their river performance. Okay. When I'm coaching people, whether it's Lex or some of my high stakes players, no matter who I'm working with, one of the most common mistakes that I observe is this misunderstanding where they think that they have to bet the nuts from out of position at a much more aggressive weight than this type of equity profile. So how do I describe this equity profile? I describe it as I would characterize it as hands that beat a large fraction of your opponent's range hands like, clearly we're beating all these hands down here. Keep in mind the ranges are symmetric. So we can look at our own range to have an understanding of our opponents. So hands like jacks and tens beat all these hands over here. These hands are quite strong in that sense, but clearly don't want to be check raising and then facing hands like aces, kings, and queens. So these hands are strong enough, like the way that I characterize it for my students are these hands, if they value bet, these hands are strong enough to win the vast majority of the time. Okay. But not strong enough to check raise. Hands that are characterized in that way should oftentimes bet almost all the time. They should not be used as checks, because if you check and turn these hands into bluff catchers, you're devaluing a hand like pocket jacks. If you check it, you're turning it into pocket sevens or pocket sixes, where you're making a statement like, I'm going to check pocket jacks. If my opponent's value betting, I lose. If he's bluffing, I win. Pocket sixes can do that. Don't convert pocket jacks into a bluff catcher when you can use it as a value bet. Okay. So in game, I'll frequently see, for example, a similar situation. I'll give you an actual real in-game example very quickly. We get to the river in game and the board four flushes. It's a passively played pot, maybe a small bet on the flop, check, check, turn. Get to the river as the out of position player. The board has four clubs on it and one heart. I don't care what the cards are. You have two pair. What should you do? You have no idea how often I see people check. You have no idea how often I see people check. It's a bet. It's a small bet, just like pocket tens. That hand class is very similar. Okay, you have two pair on a board where any club makes a flush and very little action is taking place. Your hand beats a large fraction of your opponent's range in that instance. Okay, two pair is going to win a lot, but if you check it, you're just turning it into a pair of, you're turning your two pair into any one pair hand. If you check it and your opponent bets, he's going to have a flush. And if you check it and your opponent is bluffing, you win. Well, guess what? A pair of fives would accomplish the same thing. If your opponent's bluffing, you win. If your opponent's not bluffing, you lose. Okay. So these types of this characterization of equity, this equity profile, where you can get a lot of value if you bet, but if you check and face a bet, your hand is basically a bluff catcher. That you don't want to convert these hands into that profile. So this hand where if you bet, you get a lot of value, but if you check, you can't check raise. This type of hand you want to bet. Okay. So that's very important. Again, this is one of the most common mistakes I see in terms of evaluating river play. So that's why I spent a little bit of time on it. Aces, kings, and queens. These hands are roughly characterized as the nuts. Obviously, aces is first nuts, kings is second nuts, queens is third nuts. Our opponent's range is identical to ours, so that's how it's going to work. But these hands get allocated across pretty much all of the sizing choices. So pocket aces is betting to a pot size. It's betting to half pot only 2.8% of the time. But if you actually look, it's the same frequency that this sizing is being chosen in general. Excuse me. So pocket aces is being allocated to pot, to half pot, to 30%, to 10%, and to check. Okay. So now within this, we could talk about bet sizings and some math, and we could get into some complexity, which I think is important and can be very helpful. But it's easier to do that as we evaluate the in-position player. So I'm going to stop this part, and we're going to get into the in-position player strategy now, as opposed to trying to go through the math here for out of position, because it's going to be it's just cleaner. It's just cleaner. It's going to be easier for you to understand it. So. All right, so now we're evaluating the in-position strategy. So again, you guys should be coming up with what these strategies look like before you see them, and you should have written this down from the very beginning of the exercise, and hopefully you got this down perfect. So I doubt it, but it can be quite difficult the first time you do it. You'll get better at it though. If you're struggling, you'll get better at it. All right, so what's going on? What's happening? Well, the first idea we have is we've reinforced the idea that we're going to bluff from the bottom of our range. So we're starting with pocket fours. We've included pocket fives now. We've got aces through queens as pure bets and jacks and tens to a lesser extent mixing. Okay. What else do we have going on here? Well, this looks like one color, just visually, right? So we can go over here and we can look at the bet sizes that are available and the strategy as a whole. We're checking half the time. Okay, 50% check, 50% check. We're never betting to a 10% size. Keep in mind that the out of position player was betting small. We're never betting to a 30% size. Keep in mind the out of position player was also using this sizing choice, and we're never betting half pot. So what we have is the in position strategy looks simplified, simpler, or more polar, however, whatever language you want to use. We do not have all of these small bets being deployed. Okay, the in position strategy is very simple: bet big or check. That's what has emerged. It's not my opinion. This is not what I think about it. This is what happened. Okay, with what was initially two symmetric ranges. I want to actually digress for a moment. You need to keep in mind that the in position player is not facing a symmetric range. That is extraordinarily important. Okay, the out of position player went first. Okay, so the out of position player got to the river with a given scenario, knew what the ranges were, they were symmetric, and then behaved. Okay, took certain actions. Okay, in position faces the result of the out of position player's play, or the in position player is facing the result of the out of position player's behavior. So the situation is no longer symmetric. Okay, very important to understand that. The in position player is not up against pocket fours because pocket fours bet. The in position player is not up against jacks and tens because jacks and tens also bet. Okay, we're evaluating what happens when out of position has checked. Okay, so fours, jacks, and tens are gone from the out of position player's range. Aces, kings, and queens are fractionally weighted. Only 50%, approximately speaking, of the aces, kings, and queens combos are left in the out of position player's range. Okay. In fact, visually, just so that you know, get a quick reminder of what the in position player is up against. In position is up against this. You can see that these combo fours is gone. Jacks and tens are gone. There's a lot of nines, eights, sevens, sixes, and fives. And you can see that there's about half, it's a little bit less, but it's about half of aces, kings, and queens. Okay. This is the out of position player's check strategy, so that you can see it. Just very quickly, just to keep that in mind so that you have some context for what is going on. What is the in position player facing? What does in position have to deal with and contend with? Okay. Now, in that context, aces, kings, and queens are being bet all the time. Fours and fives are, so fours is being bet all the time. Fives is mixing between check and bet. The bets are always large. No small betting for in position. I want to very quickly explain why in position is not betting small. Because again, out of position, just a very quick graphic. I'm not going to explain out of position. Just a very quick graphic for what out of position strategy looks like. Look at all of these different sizings: pot, half pot, a 30% of pot, 10% of pot, check. All these strategies are being chosen. What's the difference for the in position player? It's the power of the check. You want to think about it as, it's math based, but just for us, stories are easier. It's the power of the check. When you're out of position, the check is quite weak. Okay. When you're out of position, the check is very weak. You're just betting zero. Okay. If you check as the out of position player, your opponent has all strategic options available to him. Case in point, our opponent is checked. We can jam. We could bet at any of these sizings if you wanted, or we could check. We have all strategic options available to us. So too, if our opponent bets 10% of the pot. If our opponent bets 10% of the pot, we can still jam. We can still raise to 50 or whatever sizing we want. And we can fold, right? We can call. So we can do anything we want if our opponent bets 10%. That's not the way checking works in position. Okay? That's why I saved it for this part. As the in position player, checking is far more powerful. Cards go face up, equity is realized. Okay. So when you check from out of position, betting 10%, so when you check from out of position, you bet zero, betting 10 or 10% is very close. They're very similar. Okay. So you're going to see a lot of bleeding between those two answers, a lot of bleeding between checking and betting small, really small, like 10%, because they're very similar. They're comparable. Okay. They're close. It would be even more similar if you could bet 1% or 3% or 5% or whatever. Okay. They're very similar. All right. In position couldn't be more different. If you bet 10% as the in position player, you are introducing risk that didn't exist before. Okay. You run the risk of being check raised if you bet 10%. If you check, you can't be check raised. Your hand just goes face up. Okay. So when you think about the type of hand that wants to bet 10%, what do you think about? You think about thin value. Okay. If you recall, the hand that bet 10% the most from out of position was pocket tens. It was the weakest value bet. It wasn't value betting pocket nines. Pocket nines was, again, just visually, pocket nines is a check. Pocket tens is the hand that bets 10%. Okay. The most. That's a thin value bet. So the hands that like betting really small are by definition thin value bets. They're only capable of obtaining a small amount of value. Okay. But if you're in position and you bet 10%, you're trying to obtain a small amount of value at the risk of being check raised. It's not worth it. Okay. It's not worth it. So in position, because checking is so powerful relative to betting 10%, you don't ever bet 10% instead of check. You just check. Okay. And so too, 30%. If you get to the point where I'm at, there are some very specific nuanced situations where betting 30% could apply. I'm not going to explain those now because that goes beyond the scope of this video. But if you get to a black belt level, yes, sir, sure. In poker, yes, you can break the rules sometimes. Very rarely. But it's extraordinarily rare. In position is going to be fundamentally characterized as betting somewhat large, typically half pot plus, occasionally pot plus. In this example, pot plus. Betting fairly large, where the risk of being check raised is worth it in terms of the reward that you can capture by betting. That doesn't exist if you bet 10%. Okay, very important to understand that. So that's a very sharp distinction between out of position and in position. A lot of people understand different behavioral changes, but it's implicit. Like they behave a certain way out of position, they behave a certain way in position, but they don't know why. And if you don't know why, that leads to poor execution because you can make mistakes. Okay. All right. So we've got this very clean strategy, bet, shove or check. And then we've got what I want you to understand also is we've got a bluff to value ratio. And a big part of playing rivers is actually something called bluff to value ratio management, which I've never heard that phrase used in any kind of content context before. And I've watched a lot of content. And it's an extraordinarily important idea, but you're going to have to bear with me because I'm going to explain this because most people haven't heard it. So bluff to value ratio management simply means that when you get to the river, it's not a given that you're going to have the perfect ratio of value bets and bluffs, and you can just bluff from the bottom of your range and then value bet from the top. It's not. You have to pick the pieces and construct things appropriately given the bet sizings that you think work best. Okay. And so in this instance, we're betting pot. That's the sim has decided that pot is the highest EV way of betting. Okay. So that begs the question. We also know what we're value betting with. We know we're bluffing from the bottom. What should the bluff to value ratio be? How do we figure that out? Well, that comes from you. If you know the answer, then you should state it, write it down, whatever. If you have an opinion about the answer, go ahead, state it, write it down, whatever. Don't state it, write it down. So you have a record. Okay. What should the bluff to value ratio be? How many bluffs per value bet should we be using? Okay. So pretty simple math, to be honest with you. And these things, once you get to what we want you to do is get the common bet sizings to a level where you know them intuitively, where you're not doing math. Okay. So I know some people are put off by math. I don't want you to have to do math. I want you to there's a limited amount of memorization, but there is some memorization that's required. This is a part of it. So what's the bluff to value ratio for a pot size bet? Okay. The answer, before I do the math, is 1/3 of the range should be bluffs and 2/3 should be value. But where does that come from? It's pot odds. So your opponent is going to call. So the player calling will be calling 100 chips, and the total pot will be 300 chips. Why 300? The player who bet 100. The player who called 100. The player who bet pot. There was a pot in the middle. Okay. So the pot in the middle, the actual bet itself, and the call is 300. 300 chips will be in the middle in total. Okay. 100 is the bet, or sorry, 100 is the amount to call. So 100 is the amount to call. 300 will be the total pot after the call. 33%. Why is this number important? This number is important because 33% is the frequency. So 33% is how often the player who is calling the bet needs to win to break even with any given hand. Doesn't matter what the hand is. Doesn't matter if it's the nuts or if it's a bluff catcher. If you win with your hand as the player facing the bet, more than 33% of the time you should call. And if you win as the player facing the bet less than 33% of the time, you should fold. That's what this calculation, that's what it means. That's what it carries. Okay. So why is that important? Well, think about a bluff catcher, which is a hand that everybody knows, but a lot of people don't really fully understand it. What is a bluff catcher? Where does the EV of a bluff catcher come from? Again, you can pause the video and think about it. Where does the EV of a bluff catcher come from? It comes from the frequency that your opponent bluffs. If your opponent's value betting, you lose. If your opponent's bluffing, you win. Well, that means that you're going to win however often the other guy bluffs. Now, we've seen here that if the player betting is bluffing more than 34%, more than 33, if he's bluffing 34% or 35%, you should call with your bluff catcher because you're winning enough. If your opponent's not bluffing that often, you should fold it because you're not winning enough. So 33% is the break-even point. Okay, that's the line. So what does the in-position player, sorry, I misspoke. What does the player who's betting? What does the in-position player in this instance? What does the player who's betting need to think about? Well, they need to think about making sure that they're bluffing 33%, because at that point, the bluff catching hands in the opponent's range don't generate any profits. They can't, right? So this player needs to make sure they don't bluff more than 33% of the time. And they need to make sure that they don't bluff less than 33% of the time. And we can see that manifest itself right here in the sim. We have 3 combos of hands that are betting pure. Here we've got 0.5 of pocket jacks and roughly 0.1. You can see this is 0.52 and this is 0.8, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is roughly 3.6. Just bear with me, it's simple. Going with simple math, we like to round. We don't like precise numbers, okay? Simple math, 3.6 value bets. What do we have here? 1.8 bluffs. Okay, 1.8 bluffs, 3.6 value bets. Let's take a look at this. 1.8 bluffs, so 1.8 plus 3.6. I'm doing this on a calculator for people who are bad at math. That's okay. 1.8 plus 3.6 is 5.4. We have 1.8 bluffs out of 5.4 total combos. What's that equal? 33%. Okay, so we have 33% of our range as bluffs and 67% of our range as value bets. Okay, bluff to value ratio management. You can't just bluff with all of your pocket fives here because you don't have enough value bets. Okay, you can't just bluff with pocket sixes, etc. Right? You have to keep things. Obviously it's most relevant with respect to pocket fives. It's not all of pocket fives. It's 0.8, and there's a reason for that. And now you might ask yourself, well, how do I do this in game? Well, there are 2 answers to that. One, badly, and it doesn't matter if it's bad, as long as, because what you're trying to do is play better than your opponents. Understand that even if we play against a bot and we get beaten by a bot, we didn't get beaten by a bot for any reason other than the bot made less mistakes than we did. It doesn't matter how big the game is, it's still a closed system. The poker is closed, it's a fixed game. There's only so many options available to you. So a bot can beat you at it, and we've seen that already, okay? The bot wins by making less mistakes. It doesn't know what a perfect answer is. Neither do we. It just makes less mistakes. So your goal is to just make less mistakes than your opponent. When your opponent's not a bot and you're playing against humans, okay, all you're trying to do is make less mistakes than your opponents are. So if you know that that this idea even exists of bluff to value ratio management and what approximately you should be bluffing, you're starting to make less mistakes than your opponent because you have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. And they don't. Trust me. I work with a lot of people. Most people don't even know what they're trying to do. They play no limit hold'em, they gamble, they bet thousands of dollars or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, but they have no idea what they're trying to do. They've played a lot. They don't even play that badly sometimes, but they have no idea what they're trying to do. And so sometimes they play really badly and it's very preventable. Okay. So now you've got an idea of what you're trying to accomplish as the bettor. You've got this idea of you're betting your really good hands, hands that win the vast majority of the time. You've got this idea of bluff to value ratio management. You've got this idea of how those ratios should be set up. You can just watch and rewatch this clip, this piece of content over and over again, so you get it. And so the first answer is you'll do it badly, but that's okay if you're doing it better than you were doing it before, and if you're doing it better than your opponents. That's the first one. The second one is more technical. You could use a random number generator to manage the frequency. If you knew it was pocket fives like this, for example, you could just take this out and you could say something like, okay, this rolls 1 through 100, roughly speaking. 0 through 20, I'm going to check. And 21 through 100, I'm going to bet. And in that way, you represent this 80% betting frequency and this 20% check. Again, roughly speaking, we're rounding. Okay, so you just press the button. I'm bluffing. I'm bluffing again. I'm checking. Okay, so that is a way or a methodology of making less mistakes that you can use. So now so now you've got two answers for the person who wants to be approximately correct but not precisely wrong, which is a very valid strategy. You don't need the randomizer. You can just be like, okay, bluff with pocket fives most of the time, but not always. I can do that. And then for the person who's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to be precise, right? You've got the random number generator. It's free. You can Google one. Like you don't have to buy them. I've got one on my HUD and I've got one on my desktop as well. So in this way, you can start to accomplish the goals of what a high level strategy would look like. Okay. This is pretty simple in terms of its components. Again, like it's just you're checking hands here, betting the bottom, betting the top, and we'll stop here with some of these ideas. And next, I'll evaluate betting versus the pot size bet as the out of position player. So the out of position player checks and faces the bet, and we'll discuss some of the strategies that go into that. All right, guys. So we are now evaluating versus bet as the out of position player facing the pot size bet that the in position player has deployed. Okay. So just very quickly so that you can see, just to get a quick refresher of what the in position player is betting. In position is betting aces through queens, jacks and tens are mixing, and then fours and fives. Okay. So the first thing that we want to do is when we're evaluating our strategy and how we should think about defending versus a bet from our opponent. The first thing we want to do is we want to start with the risk reward our opponent's getting. Okay. So our opponent is betting 100 chips. The total pot after our opponent's bet is 200. Very simple. He bet 100. There was 100 there before he bet. So there's 200 in the middle now. So our opponent's risk reward is 100 divided by 200. And this 50% is an important number. Why is it important? Well, it's important because if your opponent builds a range for betting, so he has value bets and bluffs in that range, and your opponent's bluffs win more than 50% of the time, those bluffs are generating profits. And if your opponent's bluffs are winning less than 50% of the time, those bluffs are generating losses. If your opponent's generating losses with his bluffs, you should just stop bluffing. You should bluff less or stop altogether. If your opponent's generating profits with bluffs, he should just keep bluffing. He's making money. So he just keeps going and he just keeps piling on bluffs. And so essentially what ends up happening is the defending strategy versus bet will fold 50% of the time, but not more than that, with the hands that beat the opponent's bluffs. And the reason for that is because if the defending player does not do that, the player betting will continue to incrementally add bluffs. So, for example, right here, we saw here that the in position player was betting 0.8 combos roughly of pocket fives, not all of them, but 0.8 of them. If the in position player does not defend frequently enough, if the out of position player does not defend often enough against the bet, the in position player will add the balance of pocket fives and start to incrementally add pocket sixes. And if the out of position player still doesn't defend enough, it'll add pocket sevens, and then it'll add pocket eights and understand understand the goal of a strategy or understand the goal of a range in poker. Okay. It's very important. Most people don't understand what the goal is. What is the over, like so far I've given you pieces of a goal, but I haven't actually given you the entire goal. What is the goal of the entire range that you have? It's to win the largest fraction of the current pot that you possibly can. That's it. You can't, your goal with your range isn't to win more than the current pot, because your opponent can just check fold his whole range. That's always the defensive answer. You could always say, I can tell you what, you can have the whole pot. So if you're playing a game heads up with your buddy and there's $100 in the middle and he bets his house, he bets, $600,000. You could always just walk away and just give him the whole pot. You'd be like, I don't know if you're cheating or what's going on. So you can have the $100. The most you can lose is the pot. So the goal with a range is to win the largest fraction of the pot possible. So you can see the issue that would happen over here. If the player is not defending at the frequency that they need to, we start to win the pot with pocket fives more often, and then sixes, and then sevens, and then eights, until we win the whole damn thing. Okay. So how do we stop that from happening? We figure out our opponent's risk reward on their bet, which is they're betting 100. The total pot is 200. We figure out that we don't want to fold more than 50% of the time with hands that beat our opponent's bluffs. Or another way of saying it is we don't want our opponent. We want to make sure that we're aware of the fact, at least, that our opponent winning the hand 50% of the time is the break-even point for our opponent's bluffs. Okay. So now 100, 200, 54% fold, not 50. You might ask, what's going on? Well, what's going on is pocket fives is included in this range, and pocket fives is the hand that our opponent's bluffing with. Keep in mind that pocket fours is also a hand that our opponent's bluffing with, but for our purposes, we're interested in pocket fives. Pocket fours loses to our entire range. Pocket fives actually splits with pocket fives. Okay, so it's a little bit of an inelegant example in that regard, as it relates to this exact point, because essentially pocket sixes through aces are the hands that beat our opponent's bluffs, not the entire range. It's not the entire range that beats our opponent's bluffs. It's only sixes through aces. And then pocket fives actually has pocket fives, the relationship of pocket fives is a bit murky, just because pocket five splits with your opponent's bluffs, doesn't actually lose to your opponent's bluff. So it's a little bit of an inelegant example. So we get this 54% fold as opposed to 50-50, but just understand where that inelegance comes from. That roughly speaking, this math is going to be what serves you. Okay. So don't worry so much about the fact that the example came out at 54 instead of 50. Just appreciate that it's close. Okay. So we've got our defending frequency. We've got the types of hands that we want to defend with the range. And now we've got to think about moving beyond toy games to real game application. How does Jordan, or how does Lucky Fish or Yargo, my students, coaches now, obviously, how do we translate the output that we're looking at to real game play? What's the significance? How do we use this? Well, we want to go back to our own strategy first. So I'm going to take you back here to our own strategy. Understand that we checked fives through nines all the time as the out of position player. We checked fives through nines all the time. We checked jacks and tens never. And we checked aces and aces, kings, and queens about half the time each. So sometimes. Okay. So we don't have, this graphic is somewhat misleading. And if I change this like this graphic becomes, if I change it like this graphic's even more misleading. It looks like we have aces, kings, and queens at similar weights to the frequency that we have fives, sixes, sevens, eights, and nines. But of course, we know that we don't. It's just that they're small, and it is what it is. This is bigger, almost twice. This graphic should be almost twice as big as this. But it's I know to a lot of you that won't be very obvious. So our range has far more pocket nines through pocket sixes in it than it does aces through queens. Okay, twice as much pocket nines as pocket aces, roughly. Twice as much pocket eights as pocket kings, roughly. Okay, so approximately that's what's going on. So how do we use this idea that we're going to defend half our range? Well, the first thing is to understand that you don't want to defend 50% of the hands that beat bluffs. Okay, you don't want to defend 50% of any old hand that beats a bluff, because you have to subtract the strongest hands first, because these hands are automatic calls. So you're going to want to defend 50% of the range that beats bluffs, excluding hands that do not beat bluffs from the calculation. So for example, if we had deuces here, we know our opponent's bluffing with pocket fives, we would exclude deuces from our calculation. So we take 50%, we subtract the combos we have over here for the nuts, and then we have, of course, a larger number of 9s through 6s left, because these combos are only fractionally weighted. Again, you can see them, the fractions here. And again, these combos are fully weighted, okay, in our check option. And so now what do we do? Well, we know that these combos don't add up to enough of our range to defend. They don't add up. These combos are not half of our range. Okay. So we are going to have to defend some of these hands that are bluff catchers. Understand also these bluff catchers are identical. I understand that they're defending them at different frequencies, but you should understand that for our purposes, they're basically identical. Why are they identical? Because when our opponent bets, he's betting aces through 10s. Yes, 10s is not betting often, but it's betting. So aces through 10s are being bet. 5s and 4s are being bet. In that context, pocket 9s over here, pocket 9s beats 5s and 4s and loses to aces through 10s. Pocket 6s similarly beats 5s and 4s and loses to aces through 10s. In this context, pocket 9s and pocket 6s are identical. Okay. And in that, just by understanding that, you can understand why it really prefers to bet pocket 10s and pocket jacks, because turning pocket 10s into pocket 6s is bad. Okay. You've already been forced to turn pocket 9s into pocket 6s. You don't want to turn more hands into pocket 6s than you have to. So 9s through 6s are identical hands in this context. Okay. So what should we do? Well, we start with our 50% fold. We subtract the limited number of nut combos we have. And then we defend these with the balance. So we don't want to be defending these hands in aggregate. So 6s through 9s, again, never mind the individual weights. But we don't want to be defending these hands more than 50% of the time. Right, you can see that the call percentage on 6s is 24, 30 on 7s, 40 on 8s, and 55 on 9s. In aggregate, it's not defending these hands more than half the time. Okay. So we want to be defending less than half the time with these bluff catching hands. And the way that we're coming up with this 50%, we did the math. So we start with 50% of our range that beats bluffs. We subtract the hands from that 50% that are the nuts, and we're left with some number. I'm going to just spitball a number. Let's call it 35%. We want to defend 35% of these hands. And like, as you can see, that's like, that's not totally unreasonable. And you apply it to this subset. Will that guess reproduce these numbers exactly? Of course not. That's fine. We're just trying to play a defensible strategy. It's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. We want to know what we're doing and how to work. And how we work is we take our 50% defending frequency, apply it to hands that beat bluffs. We subtract the hands that are the strongest hands in our range from that calculation first, and then we defend at the appropriate weight the hands that are left over to fulfill our defending frequency requirements. Okay, and in that sense, we can pull off. We can reach the conclusion that this strategy would look something like this. Again, my personal performance would look something like defend aces through queens always, fold 5s, and then defend these hands at like a 35% weight each, because these hands are structurally very similar, if not identical. You could make arguments that maybe pocket 9s, by calling more with pocket 9s, you keep your opponent from bringing value bets further down, like expanding beyond 10s and 9s, but I don't think so. I think this is just like irrelevant. I wouldn't worry about it. Again, these hands are basically identical. So you just take all these hands, defend them at 35% weights, or some approximate number that discounts the nuts from your overall defending frequency, and then you're good to go. And in that sense, you've got now a pretty elegant defending strategy versus bets that's very resilient, even against perfectly constructed ranges, i.e. the sim, because that's what the sim's doing. So in that regard, we can now move on to the next one.